Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Elizabeth Orlein. I'm Senior Director of Research and Programs here at the National Health Council, and I will be moderating the session today. We will be speaking about informed versus intentional consent, agreement by patients for patients. Next slide, please. Okay. And as a reminder, this is a webinar of the National Health Council. Here you see many of, or all of our patient advocacy members. We feel that this topic is particularly pertinent to those members and hope that they find it interesting today. Next slide, please. Okay, and just a reminder that everybody will be on mute aside from our speakers today. And so if you have a question, please submit it via the WebEx chat function. You can see here a screenshot of what the chat function looks like. And just go ahead and submit questions through that, and we will take all of the questions at the very end. And the objectives for today's webinar are to discuss a new standardized framework for intentional consent, a concept that gives patients the ability to choose how their data can be used, who can use it, and what they can expect in return for their participation, both during a research study and after it has ended, as well as review the important role of patient engagement in the development of the standardized intentional consent framework for all patients. And with that, I would like to turn it over to our two guest speakers. We have with us today Angela Radcliffe, and Angela is a brand transformer and clinical trial expert who has been innovating in healthcare for 2 decades. She's worked on more than 100 global clinical trials across most major therapeutic areas, and she has experience across health technology, digital transformation, and marketing communications. And we also are joined today by Richie Etuaro, and he is the founder and chief executive officer of Humanity.com. Mr. Etuaro is known for pursuing the 31st human right, which is everyone has the right to legal ownership of their inherent human data as property. He's driven to reshape the world by creating a new data economy that thrives on a renewed data contract between individuals and institutions. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Angela and Richie. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Angela, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Fantastic. Angela and I are not in the same room today. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you to the National Health Council for inviting us to your delicate audience, or your important audience, to have this discussion. There are not many forums in the country, much less in the world, where we can have a conversation with patients about patients, and this is one of them, and so we are very, very thankful for it. Angela and I are going to engage in a discussion today around the construct of intentional consent, which is slightly nuanced and a little bit different from informed consent, and what led up to the purposes of this particular discussion is many of the organizations within healthcare, everything from trial companies to manufacturers to providers, are in the last 3 to 5 years rethinking patient consent. And that is for a myriad of reasons. Part of it is just the time has come. Part of it is it's triggered by compliance, and part of it is triggered by the added amount of focus on data. And as many of us know, while a consent contract is not all about data, there are many things in there that one should understand. The rules of the road around data is a big part of a consent contract. So we've been in a myriad of discussions with various players in healthcare where consent is being redesigned or in some cases reimagined. And what I found fascinating, and what Angela and I have sort of aligned on, is the majority of those conversations don't have patients in the conversation. Very often you'll find a lawyer and a technologist in the room when consent is being redesigned. More and more now, you'll see a UI, UX designer or some sort of graphic creative person to design the consent. And I think I've only seen once where the consent conversation included an ethicist, someone that had a different point of view around some of this stuff. And I found it fascinating, and that's why I think this conversation would be meaningful. I found it fascinating that every time someone would raise a question about shouldn't we have the patients in here, it's usually a big aha moment. But then not followed by including patients in the conversation in a meaningful way. It's usually a little bit softer than one would like. So what we're hoping to do today is to use this as a start of a discussion to create the type of conversation where patients can start to be actively involved in the generation of consent. Today's not about educating per se around a specific solution, but I think this is step one of many so that we can all start to speak the same language. Consent could be a very overloaded word, and it could mean many things to many people. And what Angela and I are going to hope to do today is to kind of clarify some of that and really open it up. We've got some good topic points here, and then we're really looking forward to the Q&A in the end. So with that said, I think a good, next slide please, a good disclaimer here is just to remind everyone, and I know I speak on behalf of Angela when I say this, that we're not pretending to know everything about consent. What we're attempting to do is to sort of open up the conversation. So just to level set, I think most folks understand at least the intent of informed consent, which is sort of the standard, so to speak, right now. I don't know if it's the gold standard, but it is a standard at least. And informed consent, the spirit of it is to make sure that the individual who's signing that contract knows what they are signing. And the nuance there is in the word knows, right? Some people just know that they're signing something important. They don't necessarily know what that is. Intentional consent, on the other hand, is where the individual who's signing the contract, particularly in a B2C contract on the consumer side, understands it so well that they can make intentional choices around aspects of the consent. And this is a fundamental difference in how we contract as a species. How we contract as a species today is in B2C contracts, which are business-to-consumer contracts. For most patients, and I'll tell a story here about my own patient experience. Most patients, we don't really get it that we're signing a legal contract when we're signing some of these consents. But those are called business-to-consumer contracts. That's the fancy word, right, for it in sort of the corporate corridors, are what are called contracts of adhesion. And a contract of adhesion essentially means that I'm going to give you this contract to sign. There is actually only two ways out. You're either going to sign the whole thing and agree to the whole thing, or you're going to say no. And I think if you're sitting in a hospital bed or you've got the gown on and you have a contract in front of you, while it seems like there are choices for yes or no, there's really only one choice, right? Or you walk out of the room. We believe that intentional consent has multiple choices inside of it. This is a fundamental difference, where as a consumer, when you're looking at the contract, you should be able to say, well, I want this version of it, or this version of it, or this version of it, based on what I'm looking for, right? And so that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. We're going to focus on what are the discussions that we have to move from informed consent to intentional consent when they have choices. I have two visuals to share here with you to give you a view on what we mean by intentional consent. We're going to show an example of a consent contract on a mobile app, where on the mobile app itself, there are choices that a consumer could have around the types of data privacy that they're looking for. So imagine a digital health device with a terms and conditions at the forefront of that experience. Instead of the simple I accept button, there is something that slides up that says there are different types of data access that you can have here. You can have a silver level, of privacy, you can have a gold level of privacy, you can have a platinum level of privacy. And as you select one of those, it's very clear about what you're giving up and what you're getting, right? So for example, with silver level of privacy, maybe you're giving up all the personalization and the recontacting, but you know that you're getting protection. Maybe for the platinum level, you really trust this particular provider or this particular sponsor, and you're giving up more. So this is a sort of a Fisher-Price example of it. I want to kind of bring it to life visually, where you have these precious metal categories that can go through it. And if you just go one more slide, the reason for this is, and we use Fitbit as an example here, right? The reason for this, apart from it being better for business, which we can talk through, is that it really puts the consumer or the patient in a completely different mindset. It puts the consumer and the patient in a mindset where they feel empowered, as they should be, where they get choice, they get control around these topics. So with that said, what I want to do here is to ask Angela to kind of just walk us through some of the vocabulary that we want to talk through today. Angela is steeped in the constructs of consent, and we've sort of highlighted a couple of words here, which we will kind of talk through. And again, the purpose of this is to start. I see this as step one of the ongoing conversation around Urdu. So Angela, with that, you want to share with us a little bit about your experience, where you are, what you've seen in informed consent versus intentional, and then kind of kick us off here as we start to go through these words one at a time to start the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Richie. So hopefully already you're intrigued that we're going to have a different conversation than the one we have been having. I think many of you who spend a lot of time around the clinical research enterprise, advocating for your advocacy organizations and trying to have a voice in the conversation, have heard a lot about consent, but it's largely been about the move to e-consent. And I think we can all agree that while we're really happy that consent is being made easier, it's being made more multimedia, it's starting to push the envelope to make it closer to the health literacy needs that we actually have, the diversity of health literacy needs that we have. Talking about intentionally designed consent that is created by patients for patients, we actually do need to stop having the conversation about the move to glass from paper, and we need to be starting to have a conversation about choice. And for those of you who've been in the industry a long time, like I have, you probably think, wow, choice, that is not something that we're ever given, and that's probably so far away. But I hope that in this conversation, and sort of digging into some of these constructs, can see a way forward to a different type of consent. And so as we were talking through the way to really express what new consent would look like, we started to ask ourselves, if C isn't just for consent, what else does it stand for? And we think that there are really 12 core, topics that we can cover today. We've talked a little bit about contract, but we still need to talk more about clarity. We need to talk about channels, and not in the way that you're imagining. I'm not talking about, hey, let's talk about the type of channel that we're delivering a consent on. Let's talk about channel in a different way. Is your experience common? Do you have the opportunity to compare it? Is there a real conversation going on? Do you have an opportunity to crowdsource information before you make that choice? Are you respected? Is your dignity preserved? And more importantly, as we get to sort of that future state perspective, do you have control? Is your consent continuous? And can you carry it with you? Is it portable? So these are some of the things that we're going to dig into a little bit more. I think we can move to the next slide.
Thank you. And I don't know how we landed on a whole bunch of words that started with C. That was not the intent, but alliterations are always fun. So I'll just do the quick sort of intro on these, and then we'll talk through a little pros and cons on each one of these. Again, just to get everyone familiar with the vocabulary, so that to the extent that we move to the next step here and start to pull in a body of patient advocates and patient representatives to talk about what it could look like, we're all singing from the same songbook, right? a consent is a contract. It is a legally binding contract that could be stood up in court and defended against and debated and arbitrated. And it's important for us to start to at least discuss from a place that it is binding. The word bound is really, really important here. And once we are able to recognize as patients and as consumers that it is binding, then we think about it in a completely different way. Right? It's not something that you are giving me, it's something that you're offering me to agree to. And those are two very, very different contexts to think about. Angela, you know, I think you've got experience in this place where you could share a little bit around the pros and cons of it from the patient's perspective versus the corporation's perspective, because to the extent that both sides understand and are starting to speak to the same level of binding, that's when you can really start to negotiate.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we realize there are two very different perspectives on this contract, right? Number one, as patients, we don't get to negotiate the contract terms right now. And for many of us, our introduction to clinical research happened due to a life-changing diagnosis, or in my case, a death in the family, that sort of forced me to choose whether I was going to be part of a clinical trial. And in my case, it was observational in nature. I just had to do a cheek swab and sign the consent and send it off. And that was pretty easy. And I was looking to get to the bottom of why my brother died so young, right? So there was a real easy motivator for me. I didn't care about the terms of the contract. But if you're sitting, you know, next to your spouse when they get a life-changing diagnosis, and the next thing that's handed to you is a complex contract that basically says, maybe for the best chance that you have to survive, we want you to participate in this clinical trial, that's an awful lot to take in. And so as consumers, we are very rarely in a position to negotiate or not negotiate, in this case, a contract that has so much significance in our life. And so really starting to have an awakening as consumers and as patient advocates around how we can start to provide the perspective that, hey, I'm not just indemnifying you against making some, you know, you've informed me of the risk. And so I've signed on the dotted line, I'm okay with doing this. We really need to be thinking about how can we start to just level the playing field a little bit on what we're bound to and have a little bit more flexibility and choice.
Yeah, thanks. From a contract perspective, you know, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't pretend to be one, but I've spent enough time in rooms with lawyers. I will tell you that if a contract is signed and it is not clear that both parties had a fairly equal understanding of what was signed, that contract can be debated. Right. Yeah. The next topic here is around clarity, right? Mm-hmm. So, and this is where I think Angela used a fantastic phrase there, which is e-consent is really taking paper and putting it on glass, right? Nothing about the language has changed. Nothing about the choice has changed. The only difference is instead of holding a piece of paper in my hand that's in different pages, you might have broken it up into paragraphs that work like a there's sort of this misnomer that, well, it's on an iPad and it has colors on the text and it has little icons next to it, so clearly it's clearer to people, right? I had the displeasure of having back surgery about 1.5 years ago, and of course I'm a little bit woke on this space, so I'm there waiting for the consent form, right? And I've been lucky to not having to be hospitalized before this, so they didn't give it to you up front. But you know, after I put the gown on the wrong way, and then realized I had to flip it around, between that and the operation room, I was given the consent form, and it's kind of interesting because the amount of time that's there, even if I was a trained lawyer, and even if I was fluent, if somehow or the other I could read highly legal language at high speed, high comprehension, I still didn't have enough time to really get clarity on it. And so it's important that we think about what are the mechanisms that we would need to really facilitate clarity. And clarity sometimes takes a little bit of debate, right? Because I can read a sentence and see it completely different from how you see a sentence. So a lot of times, even if you give a patient 12 hours to read a contract, and they come back and it's highlighted and it's underscored and it has sticky notes on it, it still doesn't mean that it's completely clear in the patient's mind. It just means that they had a one-sided conversation of what it is, right? So I think clarity is super, super important as we think about how do we redesign consent to be more informed where people are making choices. Channels, I think Angela, this is something that you've definitely educated me on a lot around making sure that there's consistent. Why don't you talk us through channels a little bit?
You know, when we think about channels, our natural inclination is to think about where we get our information. But when, what we're trying to do here is start to think differently about these sort of concepts. Getting the same understanding regardless of where I'm consenting, whether I'm consenting, we're not talking about medium here. We're talking about the opportunity to really contrast one experience to the next and to have some consistency, as we get there, and to feel like we are able to get a clear understanding or picture. If you'll go to the next slide, I got a chuckle when I saw this cartoon, because we probably all remember the silly bathtub ad with couples sitting side by side in separate bathtubs, and the reason this felt relevant to me is we have all of these questions, and yet how many of us have sat in a doctor's office, asked a question, and then come out of the doctor's office and felt the need to look up our own information to confirm our understanding of what the doctor said? And so trying to get to some consistency in no matter what channel we're receiving information is important. Richie, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I was often worried about or intrigued about those two bathtubs as well. Especially since everyone has to clean their own bathtub, right, if you're in a marriage. But the channel is important because you are signaling certain things to a consumer or a patient on one channel, and then you're engaging them with something completely different on paper, right? On the television channel, obviously the legalese is really, really size 4 font in the bottom, right, and that type of stuff. And I think there's a level of recognition, at least I'm seeing in the industry, with both manufacturers, providers, and stakeholders/researchers or sponsors. There's a level of recognition that we need some consistency now across the channels. Like, I can't only tell you the risks when you're in my office. That's not the only time I start to really highlight it for you, right? I need to be a little bit more thoughtful about it. The other word here that I think we need to get just familiar with and start to think through this is common. One of the triggers, and I think Eleanor from the NHC, the reason you and I engaged is, we were trying to solve for a particular customer of our problem, which is how do I make sure that, the patient is not going from one trial to another and having to get re-educated across the board, right? Yes, if right now, the state of the art right now is, fine, you'll tell me what you want me to think it means because I have to be informed, and I'll sign it anyway because I don't really know what it means. But to the extent that it's redesigned and visuals are used and choices there, I kind of know what it means now, so now I'm more engaged. But if everybody's doing it differently, when I go from one trial to another, one person is saying, look, there's 3 different levels. There's silver, gold, and platinum, and you go to someone else, and it's orange, bananas, and tangerines, and you go to someone else, and it's giraffes and monkeys and whatever, horses, right? That's actually worse for the patient. Because now, instead of having a consistent experience where they're not necessarily engaged and really just signing away, after obviously being informed by being told how they should understand it, now they're really engaged in different things, like a new thing to learn every time. So how do we, and this I think is the crux of the transition of what we're trying to accomplish here, could we get to a point where the consent experience is common across different trial sites or different providers, et cetera? And I use this visual here of the Starbucks cup because I don't know about anybody else, but Starbucks is really confusing to me, right? Because I'm a small, medium, large kind of guy, and I still couldn't tell you which one Grande is, okay? But at least it's consistent across every single Starbucks, and that's fantastic, because when you go from coffee store to coffee store, if they're not branded, you're equally as confused, right? Because small may mean 12 ounces over here, and small may mean 8 ounces somewhere else. And there are many other industries where contracts are being standardized. In the financial industry, there's something called a SAP, right, which an investor could sign. And when they sign one, they know exactly what it is. It's always the same thing every time, everywhere. The legal construct of a clinical trial and the parameters that create corridors for use of data and discovery is not that different from one sponsor to another. It's not apples and oranges. Yes, geography, there's jurisdictional, legal things that are important. Across therapeutic areas, there are contextual things that are important, like a trial in derm might be different from a trial in oncology. But for 5 trials in oncology from different sponsors, it's really not that different. Why is it that it has to be so unique and contextualized to that trial where it's different across the board? And so we think as patient advocates start to talk about the next generation of consent and to introduce intentionality, not just being informed, one of the things that should be advocated for is commonality. I ought to be able to know that this is the one that works, that everybody else is signing. And in addition to that, in the absence of commonality, is the notion of comparison, right? I should be able to know, if you're going to give me choices, what are the difference between one choice and another, right? And I'm not just talking about a choice as in an I accept button. My point of view is that in about 10 years, if a company or any entity were to put an I accept button in front of a consumer, a patient, anyone else, we will start to refuse it. Right? Just today, as we stand today, of the 4 billion people connected to the internet, each of us click I accept an average of twice per month, which is 96 billion I accepts are being clicked annually right now by human beings. And again, as we think about the discussion so far, these are contracts that you're binded to, right? I'm pretty sure many people on this call have probably a couple of hundred contracts that they've signed with each other, with organizations. So if you're going to give me choice, I need to understand why one choice is different from the other, not just choice so that I can pick one. Go 2 slides forward for me, please. And then this introduces the whole notion of conversation. I think a lot of the work that's being done right now in the e-consent space is to move it to glass so that it could be broken up into pieces so that conversations could be had around it. There are specific types of conversations that should be had, particularly about not just the risks and the indemnifications, but from a time horizon. And Angela has some really good points of view on this. Angela, from a what happens after today, can you talk us through why we need to really think about a long-term relationship conversational-wise and an example there? Because a lot of times it's about what's going to happen today, not necessarily what happens in 3 months or 6 months or 9 months. Share with us a little bit around that, Angela, so we can think about it.
Well, for any of you who have touched the oncology space or who have dealt with a cancer diagnosis yourself or in your family, you know that the conversation that you have around your decision to to go down a particular treatment path is the first domino in a series of dominoes that can fall in your treatment journey. If you say yes and consent to one trial, you may be cutting yourself off from other trial opportunities that could save your life should that trial not save your life or put you into remission. So being able to have a conversation that doesn't just center around this moment in time and this one choice, but the broader choice about your health is so important. So often it would be great if we had this sort of easy button recommender system for our health, so that like when we bought shoes, we could pick that we want, size 8 and the color blue, and we want flats, not heels. And then we'd have all this information in front of us that would help us with that sort of comparison, and to have sort of a cheat sheet for that conversation. So it's really important, I think, that we start asking, how do we broaden the conversation out? So it's not point in time for this particular contract, but it is about sort of the overarching contract that we have with ourselves and our health, and how we're being cared for. So that's really what I think we should think about there, Richie.
Good. So we're going to turn up the speed just a little bit here as we go through the back end of the vocabulary. Again, if you've joined a little bit late and we're getting together here, something to think about is, as we all start to have this conversation around additional consent, we have to recognize that it's not just about data, and it's not just about what I sign. So crowd, I think, is important. I kind of chose this phrase. Can you give me a moment to talk to my cousin Vinny? If any of you have ever seen the movie My Cousin Vinny, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you go to the image here on the next slide, I happen to be one of those individuals in my family where all my uncles and aunts always call me when they have contracts. I have an uncle who called me from the hospital and said, I need you to take a look at this contract right now. And I'm like, do they have a way to do that? He's like, no, it's a paper. I'm like, well, can you take a picture and send it to me? He's like, well, I had to put my phone away in the locker. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I can't help you right now, right? We need to recognize that patients have people in their lives who they trust, who they call on when they have to make these decisions, and they want to be able to pass that off to that individual. I mean, imagine how beautiful it could be where you send it to me ahead of time and I send it off to my smartest cousin who happens to maybe dropped out of law school or something, but at least he's better than my cousin Vinny, to take a look at it, right, before it gets there. Next slide, please.
And he won.
Yeah.
He did win.
Yeah, right. So I think a lot of part of this is courtesy. I personally have been in situations where, if I'm with a provider and the provider doesn't necessarily know that I work in this space, I definitely feel stupid, right, where I'm being spoken down to from a language perspective. I think this is one that we need to really think about. And this is not just in the contract design and the UI and the UX and the choices, but also how it's delivered, right, how it's spoken to and how it's explained. Choice, as we kind of honed in on, legal contracts and healthcare consents there are many things that you should understand in a consent form. Now, yes, data and data use is important to understand because it's a significant part of it, and we're all sort of, thoughtful about our privacy. I want to show you an example of another industry where, if you go forward one here, where here is a television manufacturer that is starting to think about privacy very carefully around data. I think most people know now that if you have a smart television, that means that you either have a microphone on that television or a camera on that television, right? Here is an industry that's not healthcare, that's not as sensitive, well, you could argue that it's very sensitive, but is looking at it saying, well, we just can't put these long terms and conditions in front of people when they're starting up their televisions for the first time anymore. We need to have a conversation with them about what their watching habits are and how that could come into play. The next after choice is control, right? I really am hearing loud and clear from the entire patient community. It's gone past the give me my damn data. Like, it's gone past that, right? That was a really good slogan and a call to action to get there. It's about me being able to know who my data is being shared with. And it's not about equity. It's not about I want to be paid for it. It's not about, I want to know how much money is being made. It's about knowing that my values and my principles are consistent with those organizations that you're sharing my data with, right? It's also about, if you go one forward here, it's about first party versus second party versus third party. This is a really quick example. And I chose examples outside of healthcare so that we can dream a little bit, right? A lot of times when we see examples of our own industry, we're such experts, we know every reason why it can't work. But when we see it in another industry, we can dream, right? Here's an example of an experiment with a car manufacturer where, as a first party, if you would give this car manufacturer access to the data that's coming off the car with very clear purpose that data will be used to train an autonomous algorithm to have autonomous driving in the future, they would give you a discount on the car lease, right? Think about that type of transparency around where the data is going and what it's being used for. A lot of times when we design consent, we think about first party. We never clarify second party. I know what you're going to do with the data, but can you tell me what happens once it goes outside of your boundaries? That is where a lot of the trust is destroyed. That's where a lot of the frustration comes from. Continuous. So this is an ongoing discussion that is getting louder and louder and louder. And as patients and as patient advocates, we have to bring this to the table. Can I change it over time? Yes, we understand the laws. We understand that you can and can't do certain things, but it's so difficult to change it, right? We're working with one particular customer right now who wants to really lead in this space. They want to compete on privacy. They want to compete on trust. They've gone so far as to say that they want to put the unsubscribe button in their email marketing at the top of the email. Wow. That's really walking the walk, right? Because what has everybody done for the last 2 decades? Hide that unsubscribe button as deep in that email as you can. By the way, make the font color just slightly off the background of the email so someone can't find the unsubscribe button, right? The notion of signing a binding contract that binds forever is nauseating. I happen to have some experience with data in the healthcare industry. There are many data sets that are being bought and sold in the healthcare industry where the consent that was associated with that data set is over 20, 30 years old. Right? That's just unacceptable. Right? This is the type of stuff that we as patients and patient advocates need to chat with. And then the last one is around carried, and I think, Angela, this is an area where you can really help us think through how do we talk about carried consent.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about how many contracts we all sign regularly, the statistic Richie said earlier about, an average of 2 per month per person, why shouldn't we have an opportunity to be able to carry our consent preferences with us from provider to provider? Why are we not sort of putting an easy button on this? And making it so that our consent preferences are known and that we are willing and able to release a certain amount of our data for certain reasons, certain purposes. There's been a lot of outcry in the clinical research space as the topic of data ownership has been discussed around whether it will will sort of make people want to stop sharing their data for clinical research or whether it will make them want to do it more. And that's an active debate. But I don't know about you, but for me, if I knew that my preferences were respected, that I could change my consent over time, and that I could have my consent preferences sort of portable and with me, I would feel a lot better about using my data for good moving forward with consent. And so I think this is just a really important sort of final concept to think about, as we get into Q&A here. And hopefully we've given you an awful lot to think about as far as what does intentional consent look like and what are some of the themes that could shape it. Richie.
So thank you, Angela. Before we go to Q&A here, I think I just want to get back to why we started. We're seeing an exponential increase in companies that want to redesign and reimagine consent. Most of those conversations now are happening. It's no longer just the lawyer or the lawyer and the IT person. There's a designer in there, an experienced designer. As I said, I did have one experience where there was an ethicist in the room, which I think was fantastic, but the patients are not in the room. And what we hoped was that this sort of primer on the conversation would at least give a cursory level of education for patient and patient advocates. So as you start to get involved in these conversations, you can ask about, could I get crowdsourcing? Could you design it in such a way where I could get it 12 hours before to send it to my cousin Vinny, right? You could start to ask for, could it be compared against other contracts that you have in others? Like if I'm going for an oncology trial, right? Could you tell me how your contract is different from one sponsor to another? And obviously this webinar will be available. But I think the more educated that we can get on these concepts, the more likely it is that we can advocate for the benefit of ourselves. Because it's one thing to say, yes, I've got a patient advocate in the room. That's fantastic. It's another thing to say that patient advocate was woke, and they really knew what to ask, and they really knew what to discuss. And as a result, there was value for it. We just didn't check the box. And so that's what we're hoping this conversation serves. I think there's going to be many more discussions around this over the quarters to come, but hopefully this kind of wakes up the discussion. With that, I'll hand it back here to our colleagues from the National Health Council to kind of walk us through the Q&A session.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Richie and Angela. That was a wonderful presentation. I wanted to start off with a question, and it's as follows. You mentioned that looking to other fields can help us dream, but kind of bringing it back to patient engagement and patient advocacy world, what do you think it would take to move us to a place where patients can accept some elements in the consent and reject others?
Yeah. So there are, I know for sure right now of two clinical trial sponsors that are in top 50 pharma that are experimenting in the proof stage of what it would look like to give what I would characterize as personalized consent to patients. So I can't tell you that it's in 3 years or it's 5 years or in 3 months or 5 months, but what I can tell you is that 3 years ago, that conversation was not happening. What I can tell you was that 6 months ago, that conversation was not happening. And so I think this is a good step in the right direction. What I think is important for us as patients, as we all are, is to recognize that one of the most effective ways to be in that conversation is to participate with value. And so to be able to know the nuances of it will help us participate with value. I can tell you that, a lot of times, when you invite other stakeholders into a conversation, most people are just doing it to check the box. But I think if stakeholders are interested about it. I also think that the competitive nature of the space is starting to come to life. There are, more seats for trials that are available, right, for specifically in certain geographies and areas. And I think, patients are starting to realize that all trials are not the same, right? There are trials that come from certain sponsors that are more ethical, that will return more insights, and things of that nature. One of the very, very easy toggles, as we like to call them, that could be toggled is, the return on insights, right? For example, if you are more compliant to the instructions or the protocol, so to speak, maybe you qualify for a higher level of return of insights, right? These are all negotiable toggles that could be in there that we can talk about. The issue is we just don't have that right now. I would go as far as to say that I believe that we will see the first clinical trial with intentional consent where there's choices around key toggles in the U.S. I can't speak confidently about other geographies within the next 2 years.
I can also,
based on the pipeline.
I can also say that we've hit sort of a tipping point with sponsors being willing to actually act on patient feedback that they're receiving in protocol design, et cetera. There was just a recent example given at a conference, and I think that actually this consent topic could help push us even further. So for the first time ever, I saw a sponsor get up and say, here's all the things we heard. And when they were asked, well, what did you actually act on? Because a lot of times we give the feedback, but then there are 16 reasons why we couldn't change adding this blood draw. We couldn't, take away this one visit. And they actually acted on some significant feedback, things that I've never seen done before. And I think the consent conversation, by shifting this to say, hey, you don't have to take this out, but can I have a choice whether I do that extra blood draw? Potentially having the choice come in consent might give sponsors the opportunity to act on more pieces of feedback, because they still will get a significant sample of their trial participants doing sort of the extra endpoints, the extra PK, the extra blood draws. And for those who don't want to do it, they still have the choice and they still get the benefit of the trial. So this could be a key lever in making change really happen with the way clinical trials are conducted.
I also think that there is more evidence that this will come to life faster, because in the past, the language would theoretically come from the pharmaceutical manufacturer for the contract, and it would be given to a CRO, and how they do it is up to them. Right, whether it's a pigeon with a note on their leg or a smoke signal or a proper contract, right? The manufacturers are getting much more involved upstream now. And I want to know how you're delivering this particular consent, right? Specifically since that informs how they use data. It informs what they can do with data. It informs, how long they can use it, et cetera. And in the wake of the regulatory sort of awakening, there are almost 100 countries right now that are drafting laws that are inspired by GDPR. That is a tsunami of concurrent regulation in a specific topic that we have not seen in decades in the world, and I think that's going to create a wake of awareness across the space. So I don't think it's that far out.
That's something that immediately came to mind. In fact, I jotted it down, is GDPR and the California Consumer Privacy Act. Could you speak a little bit about how this type of a solution may help overcome those types of challenges?
Yeah. So the one of the hallmarks of GDPR, and I'll treat the two pieces of regulations as similar. They're not similar. I wouldn't say they're dissimilar, but they're not similar. But for the purposes of this discussion, let's treat them as...
I want to make sure everybody knows what GDPR is. Could you just take a minute on that?
Yeah. So GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation from the EU, and CCPA is the California Consumer Protection Act. You fall in love with the acronym so much you kind of forget what they actually meant in the first place, right? These are two large pieces of regulations that govern how data is handled and how data is not handled. One of the hallmarks of those is something called the right to be forgotten. And this is a fascinating phenomenon, and quite frankly, I'm glad we have it, which is you ought to be able to say to an organization, hey, I'm really thankful for the service that you provided, but that service is over now, and I need to know that you can delete everything that you had on me. For starters, that's a pretty heavy burden for corporations, because corporations are not designed for those to handle those types of requests right now, right? There's one of the challenges with data is that data never really comes with its instructions on how to use it and what it should be done with, right? You sign a data purchase agreement or a data consent agreement, and then the data goes off into the wild. So things like GDPR and CCPA are waking up conversations within organizations around how do they look at the provenance of consent, right? How do they look at where that data came from? I have one particular customer that we're working with outside of healthcare, so this is not a healthcare example, but they're buying data from a data broker, and they've never bothered to ask that data broker, about the contracts that the broker has with the consumers. And so now they want to inspect the contracts that the data broker has with the consumer to see that there was a legal corridor that carried through in that lineage to make sure that that could happen, right? These conversations are waking up spend within these organizations. And a lot of that spend is compliance spend, it's regulatory spend, and most of these companies are for profits, so they're asking, okay, if we have to spend this big amount of compliance spend, how could we spend it in such a way where it actually improves the relationship with our customers or patients or subjects, where it improves the engagement, where it generates trust, it builds trust. So I think the upshot from GDPR and CCPA, in addition to all the things that we know, is that it's creating a lot of spend within organizations. I mean, corporations are spending money to comply, and it is such a sudden bubble of spend, like such a bump or a spike of spend, that many sensible executives are saying, well, if we're going to spend this money to comply anyway, could we actually change something about our business with it, right? And so it's really changing it from an OpEx to a CapEx conversation. And that's what's waking up a lot of these discussions around, should we change the way we engage with the customer? You know, I think the I accept button, I don't know, maybe by the time I'm ready to leave this particular physical state, my tombstone might say, this guy killed the I accept button, right? I think the I accept button will be dead, right? The I accept button is becoming a moment of distrust. Corporations are recognizing that, and it's being woken up by the regulations, and the spend is so big, the implications are so wide, that it's opening up conversations for people to say, well, I mean, we're just not going to do this to check the box, right? Let's go forward, and trust is what's starting to come to the forefront.
I think this question that's up in the chat is very similar to one that I had in my mind, and that's, what kind of receptivity are you seeing, especially within the medical product development area, with the idea of getting rid of their standard documents that they've created over umpteen years and that they just simply reuse and reuse, and as you said, just taking the same paper document and turning it into a glass document. But what is the receptivity for going to that next step?
Yeah. So I would say more positive than I expected, and here's the evidence. I'm an IT person, right? I'm in tech. I meet with more general counsels than I meet with CIOs. The general counsel is now a strategic function in the front office activity. It's not just contracts and protection. You know, there's one partner that we talk to and work with a lot. That's a law firm that believes that, much like the chief marketing officer, you know, had the highest increase in IT spend and strategic power in the last 10 years, as we think about digital marketing and stuff like that, that the general counsel will see the highest increase in IT spend and strategic power as it relates to these things over the next 10 years. So I think the receptiveness is difficult to measure, but to have the general counsel in the room, not in a formation where everyone's on the other side and he or she's on this side saying no, right, but in a formation saying what if, right, I think that is to me, that's the bellwether, so to speak, right? That's the leading indicator that this is being taken seriously. And if we think about these contracts, right, and we think about choice, we're not talking about contracting at a segment of one, right? This is not 50 people in a trial and each 50 of them has different contracts. It's really 12, maybe 24 versions of the contract that has to be preordained and packaged into choice, right? This is where I think the opportunity lies.
Can we spend the last few minutes that we have on what is your vision for how patients could become more engaged in this process? Your thoughts on where you see that going and how that could be, how that could materialize.
Right. So, I think what my hope is that the cooperation that we're seeing between trial sponsors around digitizing trials, around digitizing consent, et cetera, will start to build a stronger relationship with the patient advocacy community where it's a conversation of equals. I would like to see, and I think this is the first step. I think we should be able to bring it to life, where sponsors and legal folks and tech folks and design folks and patient advocates and patients and providers are in the same room in a conversation of equals. When I say conversation of equals, what I mean is there shouldn't be 5, 6 prep meetings before you speak with the patient or the patient advocate to walk on eggshells around it and prepare what to tell them so you can hear them say what you want them to say. I'm talking about a true conversation of equals, and I think this conversation here, and hopefully there are going to be many more of these, is helping. Look, corporations are talking about this every day, right? If you're talking to a head of privacy in a big sponsor, they're having this conversation multiple times a day. You can't expect a patient advocate who is having this conversation once a month at most to be in a conversation of equals. So I think a part of it as a patient advocate community is we just have to get familiar with the topics. We need to broaden our scope. We need to get a little bit more relevant. And I think it is in that relevance that you will see that invite start to grow further. And if I take the posture of the corporation for a second, it's not in your, it doesn't generate value to just have the patients in and not really contribute to the conversation. And so that's why Angela and I thought vocabulary was a good way to kind of sort this out, right? Good conversations start from common vocabulary, right? And I think corporations are speaking, consent in Spanish, and patient advocates are not even speaking a Latin-based language. They're speaking in Mandarin, right? And I think if we can get really clear on what we're talking about, I think the sponsors are going to be delighted to have a conversation with patient advocates and patient groups if we're speaking the same. And I think the measure is how much prep work has to go to dumb down the conversation to speak to each other. That's the question.
So it sounds like you're envisioning that it would be at a maybe company-by-company level that the engagement would happen, at least initially?
I think initially that would be the case, but look, I'm doing some work with the IEEE, which is the largest standards body in the world, to put together standard frameworks around how data governance contracts should be interpreted. So yes, you can write the legal language the way you want, but it needs to be translated into rules that should be associated with data. That could spark an event where multiple sponsors are in the same room with multiple patient groups at the same time. One of the things I think, one of the reasons why we're so honored to have at least the National Health Council facilitate this conversation is that, I don't think we are far away from having, 5 of the top pharma companies in the world with 5 of the top patient advocacy groups in the world brokered through a standards organization and an advocacy organization to be able to talk about what consent should look like. Because it's in everyone's benefit to make sure that it's somewhat consistent.
Sure.
Well, and I would just add a little sort of call to action that's very practical on this topic for patient advocates, right? We've asked for a seat at the table for a long time, and now we're getting a seat at the table, but we're so excited that we finally got the seat at the table that we're just eating the meal that's being served to us a lot of the time. We actually get to make the meal together now. And so you have an opportunity to lead in leveling up the conversation away from just paper to glass, away from just health literacy. And I say just health literacy lightly when we have 9 out of 10 people who don't have the literacy they need to make the decisions. But you have an opportunity to level the conversation up and help make and serve that meal and not just sit at the table and eat what's being served to you. So, I would challenge all of you to use your voice now that you do have a seat at the table to really have a different conversation with sponsors, because as Richie said, I think they'll be delighted to hear.
Great. Well, it's now 3 o'clock. Thank you so much, Richie and Angela, for your presentation. This was wonderful. It will be archived on our website, so if anybody wants to rewatch, you're welcome to do so, but we really appreciate your time. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.